Brexit. There's plenty to read. Now, research published today suggests council tax rises are on the way across England, predicting they will be the largest hikes for 14 years. The Chartered Institute for Public Finance and Accountancy has asked all local authorities to provide figures for council tax rises. According to the survey, council tax bills in April will be £80 more for the average property in England. There will be some big regional discrepancies, with Band D properties in the North East due to pay, on average, a hike of almost £1,800 a year. That's £250 more than taxpayers in Outer London will be paying, according to the survey. Here's the Chief Executive of CIPFA, as it's known, Rob Whiteman.
So the headline figures from our research are that council tax is going up by an average of 5.1% across the country. That's about £80 per year for most households, and that's the biggest increase we've seen for 14 years. Two of the biggest pressures that councils face are adult social care and children's services. Obviously, the number of people approaching old age has gone up, and therefore there's more elderly care needed. And for children's services, there's a mixture of more children with learning disability requiring packages, but at the same time, the role to protect children who are vulnerable has also seen quite an increase. So in both those areas, councils are generally spending more money than they have resources to do.
Right, just before I go on, I think I said a hike in £1,800 a year. When we're talking about regional discrepancies with Band D properties in the North East due to pay an average of almost £1,800 a year, I apologise. Now, we did ask the Department for Communities if a minister was available to talk about this, but no one was. I am joined now from Nottingham by Alison Michalska, who runs the Adult and Children's Services in that city and is also the current president of the Association of Directors of Children's Services. And with me here in the studio is the Conservative MP Kevin Hollinrake, who sits on the Local Government Select Committee. Welcome to both of you. Alison, first of all, the Local Government Association says that by 2020, councils will have lost more than 85% of central government funding compared with levels in 2013. You work on the front line providing children's services in Nottingham. How have the cuts affected you?
Well, they've had an absolute devastating impact, not just in Nottingham City, but actually up and down the country. Because what we see in places like Nottingham is that as the government grants are reducing, and although council tax is going up, in the poorest areas like Nottingham City, that raises the least money. Nottingham City, like many places, is very, very deprived. We have estimated around 60% of our families live in poverty. So what we know is that a council tax rise raises the least money in places like Nottingham. What we've also seen up and down the country is a huge increase in demand. So just as money is going down from government to provide for children's services, the demand is going up. So the increase across the country we've seen in the last 10 years, just shy of an 80% increase in the number of children who need to be subject to a child protection plan. And year on year, the children in care numbers are rising by around 3% a year. And they, of course, are the most expensive services. And what councils like Nottingham are having to do up and down the country is to reduce its early help and early intervention services.
Right.
And that means that actually we are not able to help children and families early, and unfortunately then they reach crisis, and that's when we need to be intervening with our most expensive levels of service.
Right, so you've said that the council tax rises will help a bit, but as you've also said, it raises the least money in some of the most deprived areas.
Absolutely.
So what do you actually want to see the government doing?
So ADCS launched a policy paper at the back end of last year called A Country That Works for All Children. And what we want the government to do is to recognise that actually, if it wants to be a country that works for all people, it first and foremost needs to be a country that works for all children. What we need is a sustainable funding settlement for children's services. The LGA has estimated that by 2020, the gap in funding for children's services will be at least £2 billion. And without that sustainable funding, we are unable to continue to provide the very effective early help, early intervention services, be they children's centres, be it youth and play services, be it family support. They're the services whereby local authorities up and down the country are helping families to care for themselves, to care for their own children. And without that, what we need to do is to respond more urgently and with more expensive intervention services.
Right. Well, Alison has laid out extremely clearly and powerfully the challenges for local government and for people like her who are providing and working in frontline services. What are you going to do about it?
Well, I agree with lots of things that Alison said. In 2016, the Secretary of State did give a 4-year funding settlement for local authorities.
But it's really not enough, as you've heard.
Well, there's a real terms increase between 2018 and 2020. But let's put this in context. In terms of our national finances, we are still spending far too much. We are spending 40 billion pounds every year more than we're collecting in taxes. That was 150 billion when we took over the economy, run the economy in 2010. At the same time, we've halved unemployment, and we're one of the fastest growing economies in the G7.
So why are there these sorts of problems then facing the country and the government?
Local authorities, like every other department of government, has to look at its own cost, has to become more efficient. Nottingham itself was just saved £27 million every year in terms of efficiencies. So local authorities have become more efficient.
Right.
So
they've fulfilled what the governments have set to them. They have cut services and spending to the bone. There is no more. And we have had a succession of local government representatives saying that. Conservative, Labour, Liberal Democrat, right across the board. And so what are you going to do? It's not enough to say, look at the context, that we are spending X amount of money and it's gone up in real terms. Well, there are far more elderly people. Absolutely. There are far more children with complex needs. So to say that you're going to continue cutting doesn't answer that question.
I didn't say that. Well, the local government is seeing a real terms increase in its funding over the next 4 years of this current spending round, which over the next 2 years of that left. Beyond that, you're absolutely right. There's two things we need to do. The biggest pressure local authorities are getting, which accounts for about 34% of its spending, is adult social care. We need a long-term, sustainable model for funding of adult social care. We need to put an extra £9.4 billion in for this spending round, but we need to put more money in the futures. I personally think we should look for a social insurance solution to adult social care, but that's something we need to get right. The other thing we need to do, and your clip earlier illustrated it perfectly, is the funding of local authorities is totally unfair. So Nottingham gets around £800 per person per year in terms of funding, whereas parts of London, wealthy parts of London, they get £1,100 a year to spend. That is simply not right. So what the government's committed to do is put in a new fairer funding review to make sure all areas get a fair amount of funding.
Less?
No, absolutely not. More. It will be more money. But it will be fairer, so people like Alison can do the good job that they do with the right amount of resources.
Alison, do you like what you've heard from Kevin?
Well, speaking parochially for Nottingham, a fairer funding that would benefit Nottingham City, of course I like that. But I think that what we have got to be really clear is that it is actually some of our most efficient and most wealthy councils that are also really, really struggling. And it's the lack of a comprehensive tackling child poverty strategy that I think is getting in the way, and that would be great if government could address that. But it is about, yes, you know, money is going up in some areas, but it's not going up anywhere near as the level of demand and the level of need that we have, and that is across adults and children's services.
You've listened to the debate here. Do you think it's fair that council tax goes up, that the government is trying to get local government to make those decisions, to distance themselves, some would argue, from painful decisions that are being made at a local level? Do you think it's right the constituents should pay more, perhaps up to 5% more?
Well, I think there's a good case for people like me paying a bit more, perhaps, but I'm not sure about how fair a council tax is. I'm sorry for beating my drum, but what really sticks in my craw listening to what Alison said is the fact that we're talking about paying £10 billion a year. We are paying that now to the EU, and Alison only needs £2 billion. And a lot of people have been saying what we pay to the EU isn't much, but it should be allocated to this country. So
what do you say to that?
Brexit point for you.
Well, it'd be interesting to see what happens in terms of Brexit, in terms of whether there's any damage to the economy, or whether that £10 billion we can spend in other areas. It's been promised to a number of different areas already. But I think we've got to look at local government financing in isolation, and that's got to be about fairer funding, so everybody gets a fair amount for the needs of that local area, but also the fact that we have a sustainable model for adult social care.
Should there be a re-evaluation of council tax properties?
I don't think that is the principal problem. I think it's about distributing the money more fairly.
All right. Alison and Kevin, thank you both very much. After